Amelie's shoes were worn thin, her hands trembling as she walked through the crowded streets of Johannesburg with nowhere to go. She had given everything to her family, only for them to turn their backs when she lost her job. That night, with the city lights cold and distant, her strength finally broke. Tears poured down her face as she sank to the pavement, hugging herself against the chill. People passed, staring but not stopping. In her desperation, she reached out and stopped a tall stranger, her voice cracking as she begged, "Please, just a hug." She didn't want money, she didn't want pity, she only wanted to feel human again, even for a second. The man stiffened, surprised, but then she clung to him like her life depended on it. His suit smelled faintly of cedar and power, yet beneath the fine fabric his heart beat unsteady. This wasn't just any man. He was Mbeki Okoro, one of Africa's most feared and untouchable billionaires, a man who never allowed anyone near him. People bowed to him, feared him, but never touched him. And here was a broken woman, staining his chest with her tears, asking for nothing but warmth. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't push her away. He held her, awkwardly at first, then tighter, as if her pain cracked something deep inside him. In that moment, Amelie thought she was clinging to a stranger, but in truth she had shaken the soul of a man who owned everything, except the simple touch of humanity. Mbeki Okoro was a man the world feared. People spoke his name in hushed tones, saying he could buy a government with one phone call or crush an empire with a single decision. His face was always calm, unreadable, and his life was wrapped in bodyguards, black cars, and power that most people could not even imagine. To many, he was untouchable, a figure too high above ordinary life to ever be questioned. But behind the perfectly tailored suits and the cold eyes that never seemed to blink, there was a wound no money could heal. He had lived too many years surrounded by people who wanted his wealth, his influence, his signature, but not his heart. He had forgotten the warmth of being truly seen, the simple comfort of being touched without motive. His world was filled with gold, but empty of love. That night on the street, when Amelie had clung to him, her tears soaking his chest, something broke inside him. He had not felt that kind of raw, desperate honesty in decades. She did not know who he was, she did not care about his power or money. She had asked for nothing but a hug, and in giving it, she had reached deeper into him than anyone else ever had. Her trembling body, her voice begging for nothing more than warmth, haunted him long after he stepped back into his car. His mind, usually so sharp and controlled, kept drifting to her face, to her broken voice. For the first time in years, he could not sleep. He lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment. The sound of her sobs had slipped past his armor, and her touch had felt like fire on skin that had long gone cold. He wondered who she was, what pain had brought her to that moment, and why her hug had left him feeling weaker than any boardroom battle ever could. The world thought he was a machine, but inside he felt shaken, confused, and strangely alive. Mbeki had dealt with presidents, kings, and billionaires, but it was the memory of a woman with nothing. No job, no comfort, no home that night, that refused to leave him. He found himself distracted in meetings, his pen frozen above contracts, his thoughts slipping back to her tear-stained face. He had built an empire by never letting feelings control him, but now, against his will, he was obsessed. He wanted to know her name. He wanted to hear her voice again. And though he did not yet understand why, he felt that if he walked away and forgot her, he would lose something more valuable than all the power he had ever gained. For the first time in his life, Mbeki Okoro, the man who owned half of Africa's wealth, was not in control of himself. And it all began with one hug on a cold Johannesburg street. The next morning, Amelie woke up with swollen eyes and an empty stomach, thinking the strange hug with the tall stranger was just another forgotten moment in her hard life. She had no idea that the man she clung to was replaying her sobs in his mind like a song he couldn't turn off. Mbeki Okoro, who usually moved through the world like a ghost, was restless. He could have returned to his empire and left the memory behind, but something inside him refused to let go. He ordered his people to find her, not with the cold precision of a billionaire hunting down a name, but with a strange urgency he didn't even understand. And when he finally stood in front of her the next day, Amelie could hardly believe it. She recognized the expensive coat, the same steady eyes. Her heart skipped, but fear quickly followed. Why would a man like him come back for her? He didn't hand her cash or make her feel small. Instead, his words caught her off guard. "I want to give you a chance," he said simply. Not charity, not pity, but a door into a life she had never imagined. He invited her into his world, a world she had only seen in magazines and on TV, the kind of world where marble floors shone under crystal chandeliers, where people dined with presidents and walked through golden halls as if they belonged there. For Amelie, who had cried herself to sleep in tiny rented rooms, it felt unreal. She wasn't sure if it was kindness or some hidden trap, but the way he looked at her made her pause. His eyes carried no arrogance, only something raw, almost pleading. When she told her friends, they were quick to warn her. "You're just a toy to him," one said. "Rich men use girls like you and throw them away." Others whispered that she was crazy for even considering it. Amelie felt the sting of their words, but her mind kept going back to that night. She remembered how he had held her, not with desire or power, but with a quiet stillness, as though her pain had cracked something inside him. That memory gave her courage. The first time she stepped into his world, every eye was on her. The cars were sleek, the houses impossibly large, the people dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in glass cases. She felt out of place, her simple dress and nervous step standing out like a scar on polished marble. Yet beside her, Becky walked calmly, as if her presence was not a shame but an answer to something he had been searching for. She realized then that he wasn't offering her glitter and wealth. He was offering her space in his life, a chance to walk beside him, not behind. And when she dared to question it, when she whispered, "Why me?" he only looked at her with a softness no one believed he had and said, "Because that night, you saved me first." The news spread like fire. A billionaire, the untouchable Mbeki Okoro, walking side by side with a girl from Soweto. The same girl who not long ago had stood in the street crying and begging strangers for a simple hug. People couldn't believe it, and because they couldn't understand it, they mocked it. The tabloids printed her picture on their front pages, calling her the beggar who caught a billionaire. Headlines screamed that she was chasing his money, that she was a passing distraction for a man too powerful to ever settle down. At first, Amelie thought she could ignore it, but the whispers followed her everywhere. Strangers pointed, laughed, and some even spat cruel words, asking what tricks she used to capture the attention of a man like him. High society wives, with diamonds glittering on their necks and envy hidden behind painted smiles, sneered at her openly. At galas, they leaned close to each other, whispering as Amelie walked past in her simple gowns. They compared her to the polished models and heiresses they believed Mbeki should be with. "She doesn't belong here," they would say loud enough for her to hear. And though their words stung, Amelie refused to let them see her break. Even her family, the same people who had turned their backs on her when she lost everything, came crawling back with fake smiles. They called her phone, pretending to be concerned, and when she visited Soweto again, relatives greeted her with arms wide open as if they hadn't once left her in the cold. They spoke of love, but their eyes were greedy, calculating what they could gain from her new connection. Amelie saw through it, and though it hurt to admit it, she kept her distance. Through all of this, she remembered the night that had changed everything. The night she had stood on a dark street, shivering, with no one to turn to and no pride left to protect her. The night she begged a stranger for warmth, not knowing he was one of the richest men on the continent. That night had taught her something powerful: when you have nothing, all you have left is the courage to keep standing. And she promised herself she would never let society's laughter steal that courage from her. Mbeki noticed it too. While the world sneered, he saw how Amelie held her head high, how she walked into rooms filled with people who wanted her gone and still carried herself with quiet dignity. He had built his empire on strength and strategy, but hers was different. It wasn't the kind that crushed enemies, it was the kind that endured storms. And though the world doubted her, he began to trust her more deeply than anyone else. Amelie was no longer just the girl who once begged for a hug. She was the woman who refused to shrink back in the face of cruelty, a woman who had begun to find her own power in a world that wanted her to disappear. And while society gossiped, she silently wrote her own story, one step at a time. Behind the glass towers and polished boardrooms, Becky's empire was not as untouchable as people believed. To the world, he was a giant whose wealth could not be shaken, but inside his circle, cracks were spreading like silent fire. Relatives he had trusted, cousins and uncles who smiled at his table, were plotting behind his back. They wanted his throne, his billions, his power. Some worked quietly, feeding lies into the ears of his partners. Others built secret deals, hoping one mistake from Becky would give them the chance to strike. They circled him like vultures, waiting for the perfect moment to tear at his empire. For years, Becky had dealt with enemies in politics and business, but betrayal from blood cut deeper than any rival could. He could buy loyalty with money, but he could not buy love or trust from those who carried his name. The boardrooms that once felt safe now echoed with lies hidden behind polite smiles. His advisors told him what he wanted to hear, but their voices were laced with fear, not truth. He needed someone unshaken by power, someone who had nothing to gain from his empire. That someone was Amelie. She did not wear a suit, and she had no formal education in business. But she had something no one else around him did, raw honesty and the courage to speak without fear. While others carefully crafted their words, Amelie spoke straight from her heart. She could sense lies the way she once sensed danger on the streets. And Becky, who had once trusted only contracts and signatures, began to lean on her voice more than any advisor in the room. There were moments when his board would argue for hours, each man trying to twist the truth for his own benefit. Amelie would sit quietly, listening, her sharp eyes moving from one face to another. Then, with a simple sentence, she would cut through their schemes. "He is lying," she once said, pointing at a man who had served in the company for years. At first they laughed at her, mocking her background, but when the papers were checked, she was right. Her words saved Becky from signing away billions. From that day on, the laughter stopped. The more the pressure grew, the more Amelie stood firm. She didn't care about their titles or their wealth. She cared about truth, and her street-smart courage gave Becky a strength he had long forgotten. In a world of false promises and hidden knives, she became his only anchor. When others tried to confuse him with numbers and deals, it was her clear voice that silenced the noise. She reminded him that no empire, no matter how large, could survive without honesty at its core. And so, in the middle of chaos, Becky realized something shocking. His billions had built an empire, but it was Amelie's truth that was keeping it alive. She was no longer just the girl who once hugged him on a cold night. She was becoming the shield that guarded his empire from falling. Late one night, while the city outside glittered with lights, Amelie was alone in one of Becky's private studies. She had gone there looking for a book, something to distract her from the heavy whispers that always followed her in high society. But what she found instead froze her blood. On the desk was a folder, half hidden under other papers, filled with contracts and letters marked with familiar signatures. As she read through them, her heart pounded harder with every page. It was a scheme, carefully planned, cruelly written. Becky's own cousin, a man who had eaten at his table and laughed in his home, was preparing to destroy him. And worse, Amelie's name was at the center of it all. They planned to use her as bait, twisting her image into proof that she was Becky's weakness, the crack in his armor that could bring his empire down. For a moment, Amelie felt the air leave her chest. Her hands shook, and doubt whispered in her ear. Maybe this was the trap everyone warned her about. Maybe she should run, before she was blamed for everything. But then she remembered the night she had begged for a hug on a cold street, and how Becky hadn't turned away. She remembered the way he trusted her voice in those tense meetings, how he looked at her not as a burden but as an anchor. Fear melted into fire. If they thought she was his weakness, they would soon learn she was his strength. Without waiting for morning, Amelie stormed into Mbecky's office. He was surrounded by reports and numbers, his face as calm and unreadable as always. But when she slammed the folder down on his desk, his eyes snapped up in shock. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. Amelie's own voice trembled, but she didn't back down. "This is betrayal," she said. "And they are using me to do it." For a moment, the room was heavy with silence. Becky's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages, and she saw the rare flash of pain in his eyes. His own blood had betrayed him again. But before despair could sink in, Amelie leaned closer, her words sharp and steady. "If I am part of this empire, then I'll fight for it too. I will not run, and I will not hide." Becky had faced presidents, tycoons, and rivals who would do anything to bring him down, but nothing had ever moved him like those words. For years, he had lived untouched, keeping his empire behind walls of glass and steel. No one had ever stood beside him, not truly. Yet here was Amelie, the girl who once begged strangers for kindness, now standing tall with fire in her eyes, ready to face down the vultures at his side. In that moment, Becky realized he was no longer fighting alone. He had found someone who would not just share his wealth or his name, but his battles too. And together, they were about to turn betrayal into power. The night of the gala was supposed to be about celebration. The chandeliers sparkled like captured stars, and cameras flashed with every step Becky took into the grand hall. His empire was at its height, and the richest and most powerful people in Africa gathered to be seen at his side. Amelie walked beside him in a gown so simple it almost looked plain among the glittering diamonds and silks of the high society wives. But she wore it with quiet pride, her head high, her hand steady in his. She could feel the stares, the whispers, the laughter hidden behind fake smiles. To them, she did not belong here. And tonight, some of Becky's enemies had prepared to make sure the whole world was reminded of that. As the speeches began and the cameras turned, one of his rivals raised his glass with a sly smile. His voice carried across the room, sharp enough for every microphone to catch. "Tell me, Becky," he said, "how does it feel to bring a beggar into this hall? The girl who once clung to strangers on the street now clings to you. Is this your empire's new standard?" Laughter rippled through the room. Eyes turned to Amelie, waiting for her to shrink back, to lower her gaze in shame. But Amelie did not flinch. She stepped forward, her gown catching the light, her voice clear and steady. "Yes," she said, "I once begged for a hug. I once had nothing. But what about you?" She lifted her hand, holding up the very papers she had discovered, the evidence of conspiracies, of names who had betrayed Becky while smiling at his side. The room fell silent as she began to speak, each word like a blade cutting through the glittering lies. She called out the cousin who had plotted to ruin him, the partners who had signed deals in secret, the so-called friends who had tried to use her as bait. Gasps spread like waves across the hall. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the shock, the fury, the shame of the men she named. Becky's enemies tried to protest, but the evidence was undeniable. Guards moved swiftly, dragging them out one by one as the guests watched in disbelief. By the time she finished, Amelie stood taller than anyone else in the room. The insult meant to destroy her had become her weapon. The girl they called the beggar had just exposed billion-dollar betrayals in front of the world. Becky's rivals were gone, their power stripped in a single night, and the hall that once sneered at her now buzzed with awe. Becky's eyes never left her. For all his wealth and influence, it was Amelie who had turned the tide, Amelie who had shown courage no suit or crown could buy. As the cameras flashed, she did not smile with pride or arrogance. She simply stood by his side, unshaken, proving that she was no weakness but the strongest ally he had ever known. Years later, when people looked back, they always spoke of that one night on a cold Johannesburg street. They said Amelie's destiny changed the moment she begged a stranger for a hug. But the truth was much bigger than that. She had not only rewritten her own life, she had rewritten Becky's too. The man who once walked through the world like a shadow, cold and unreachable, now smiled with ease. The billionaire who was once feared for his silence was now admired for his warmth, and at his side was the woman who had reminded him of his own humanity. Together, they had survived whispers, betrayals, and battles that could have broken empires. And yet, through every storm, Amelie remained steady, carrying the same courage she once found on that broken night. Her journey from the streets to marble halls was not a fairy tale, it was proof that even the smallest act, like reaching out for kindness, could change everything. People who once laughed at her name now told her story with awe. They said the girl who begged for a hug became the heart of an empire. But Amelie never forgot the truth. She was not saved by wealth or power, she had saved herself the moment she chose not to give up. And in saving herself, she had also saved the loneliest man in Africa. Becky's empire stood stronger than ever, but its greatest strength was not money or fear. It was love, built on a night when two broken souls found each other in the dark and never let go again.